So I mentioned in my other video that I had actually found another pattern here that I was very interested in making something out of, and the artist that I found on Pinterest had an Instagram, so I checked this artist's Instagram account. When I saw these designs, I remembered that this design here, that flower, reminds me of something, and then I realized that when I looked through this coloring book and I found this design, these flowers remind me a lot of that different designs that this artist had made. She is, I think she says she's an illustrator and also a tattoo artist. She has made all of these designs on her Instagram using a tablet, so it's digital, so it's not traditional art, but still they're just as awesome. But it also means that it's a bit of a challenge if you want to get those effects using traditional mediums. I am the crazy person. I am gonna try to create that in traditional mediums, because I always need to make a challenge for myself, don't I? And I'm also thinking about adding these cool geometric symbols like a triangle or a diamond, or also create that cool effect that inside the geometric symbol there is all of these colors and shades and all that, but outside the triangle everything is just outlines. But since this one has the frame around it, I think I'm going to have to erase it somehow, if I have to. Either white ink, like I mentioned in my other video when I made the mandala butterfly. I do not have any colored pencils that are in a higher quality for me to get these vibrant effects. It worked for the butterfly, which had tiny patterns to fill in, but these flowers, they are larger areas to fill in. So I thought, what do I actually have that could work on this paper that can give me some kind of vibrant finish? And I was like, the only option I could think of was I have a set of watercolors by Winsor & Newton. Like colored pencils, you have to go lightly with a thin layer and then build up to get smooth gradients. But also, I don't know how much this paper can take when it comes to water. So I think I'm gonna do some kind of harder surface behind the paper so the water doesn't bleed through to the design on the other side. It also gives it a harder surface so the paper feels somewhat thicker. Since this paper is so thin, it's like printer paper. If you're using too much water, it's going to destroy this paper. I don't know yet how it's going to turn out. I'm never going to say if I create something that I know is inspired by somebody else, I'm not going to take the credit or glory and say that I created it all by myself. So yeah, I'm definitely going to credit this artist as much as I can with links. I'm just gonna take my time to figure out which one of these flowers that I want to create. I'm just gonna play around with it, and maybe midway through this process, maybe I'm like, oh yeah, I can do this, or can I add that, or change this. Usually always happens in my case when I don't have a plan from the beginning. Yeah, but I think it's time for less talking and start painting. Like I mentioned, the majority of this art design is supposed to be made with watercolors. I know this is very messy. I'm going to clean it before I start using it. Selected all of my ink pens in different sizes and all of my... Being an artist, I have a lot of brushes, but the thing is I don't have a lot of brushes that are useful for me. Some of them have hardened, so they're useless, they're just trash, and some of these I was able to save, so I just had to clean them a bit. Obviously I have these white markers that I've used before and the Posca marker. I have some mechanical pencils and I want to sketch out first before I commit to add all of these black details with ink. I have some white ink here, it would also work. So maybe this could work as a final touch. I don't know yet how it's going to turn out. I have no plan. I just have a guide and then some of the pictures I saved on my phone. One design here that had flowers that reminded me of the flowers in here. The sad part about this design here, I wish that this flower was like closer to this one so I can make some kind of maybe triangle or a cool diamond shade with both of these flowers close to each other so I can have them in the same cluster. Lower flower is bigger. You can see the center of the flower much better here. This one seems to be more area to work with. I want to make the triangle a bit smaller than the flowers, so some parts of the petals are outside the triangle and those parts are just going to be black line art, but inside of the flower is going to have all of these colors and gradients because that makes it stand out a lot more, give it a 3D effect. So I'm going to spend my time now to play around sketching some cool details and design with my pencils. With that I'm going to use obviously kneaded eraser, especially if you're working on a paper that is very fragile. This paper is like a printer paper and I just want to make sure that I'm not making too much damage on the surface before I even started painting. So that's the step that I'm going to do now. Sketch around, look at the other artist's work and get some ideas, some inspiration, like okay, I feel like something is missing here. Can I see something on her artwork that maybe gives me an inspiration on what could work here or here? But I'm gonna start sketching now. So I'm starting by measuring out the flowers so I can figure out where the center is. From there I have a guide so I know how wide I can make the geometric symbol that I'm creating. And I decided to go with sort of a crystal style shape, which sort of looks like a diamond but it's wider at the bottom and then it thins out to a point at the top, which is actually a pattern that I thought would work the best for the fact that the flower is so far down on the paper that it would be too narrow to have a large diamond shape there. And from there I'm just playing around with different borders and lines and symbols and adding some petals and other stuff. And also I'm trying to figure out which part of the petals of the flower I want to have outside of the diamond and inside the diamond where it's going to be colored in with watercolor. So I did some redefining off camera, some of the designs on the petals and the leaves and some of the vines, and I changed the parts that is going to be filled in with black and other areas are going to be white lines, and I need to make sure that I know which part is going to be black and which parts are going to be white. Try to think about that right now. And I think the best thing to do now is if I added some white to remove some of these details right now before I add the black. Hopefully it will work, but I think I got the basic design down. The plan that I had from the beginning seems to work. So now it's the process of starting with the coloring part. The sketching part is now done and it's just time to fill it all in. So I'm using brushes in different sizes when I'm applying the white ink to all the details around the design. And I will also add a thin layer of the white ink and let it dry, and then I will see if I want to add another layer if I find it necessary. So as expected, the paper started to become a bit wobbly from the moisture of the white ink. So I found that the best option was to cut out the paper from the coloring book, tape it down to a cutting board for a harder, stronger surface. So this is hopefully going to keep the paper flat and lower the risk from it getting deformed. So this is how far, or so far, what it looks like. Looks even more than I expected actually. Even though the white ink, it has covered the majority of the details that I wanted to remove, but still, if you look close up, you can see some of the black peeking through. But I feel that if I fill in these details here with black ink, it's going to make the white ink much brighter because you have the contrast of solid black around it. You're going to trick the the eye to think that the white background here is much brighter than it actually is. Yeah, I'm gonna wait a couple minutes for this white ink to dry, and then I'm going to go over with the black ink, one of my black ink pens. I have different sizes. This is number 05. I have all the way down to 003, and the thickest one I have, I think it's 09. And I also have this black ink that is like a brush, so you can make thicker and thinner lines. This one isn't great for sharp straight lines like the ones that I have for the diamond and all the other lines here, but if you're filling in a larger area that you want to fill in with black, instead of just brushing over it with these thinner ink pens, you can use this black ink brush. I can first fill in the outlines with a thinner ink pen, and then I can fill in the rest of that area with the brush pen. So I'm gonna let this dry, and then I'm gonna start working on the black ink and see how that goes. So like I mentioned, I'm using the ink pens to create a sharper straight line, and I'm also using these ink pens for all of the tiny details like the dots and filling in all the petals and vines. And as a final step, I'm going to use the ink brush that I showed you earlier. So I worked a little bit off camera, just a little bit, nothing intense or nothing extreme, just added a little bit more white ink. When I saw the finished design here, when I have added all of these black ink details, the design looks very bottom heavy. It feels like most of the details are further down and it's not much happening on top. If I show you the finished result here, if you see here, since I added more white ink, I felt that I had to include something else up here. So that's why I added more of this white ink to the design, so I can then add something here to fill this area up. Something just to add something extra to the upper part of this design that I have. See if I can have something to take inspiration from and include in this drawing, either if it's dots going in a geometric pattern or just lines or something. I think I'm going to have to do some more sketching, and then I can fill those areas in with black ink like I did the other details here. So it's not going to be anything different from what I did before. But I'm just gonna start sketching more lines to this design, and then we can start working on the coloring part. You need to excuse the lines that shows up on the screen here. I changed the angle that I placed my digital camera, and for some reason it was very sensitive depending on the angle I had the light source. So if the light source was pointing towards the digital camera, it seemed to be very sensitive, so all of these lines started to show up. I didn't notice that before until I uploaded the files to my computer, but now I know that it's because of the light sources. So I'm going to place my softboxes somewhere else for the upcoming recordings. So the main colors I decided to go for are red, purple and yellow. Red and purple are going to be used on the petals of the flower, meaning red in center and purple at the end of each petal. And the center of the flower are going to have these warm tones of yellow and orange. As you can see here, I have a separate piece of paper that I can mix the shades that I'm going for and see that I have the right shades. And these are the brushes that I'm going to use. So first I'm going to dip the brush in water, and then I'm going to start mixing the shades that I'm going for. So I'm obviously going to start with each petal of the flower, and you can see here that I've already started to figure out the ombre effect that I'm going for. And obviously now you can see that I'm applying a very thin layer, meaning a lot of water and less color. But later on I decided to go with more color and less water, because I noticed that the paper seemed to react much better if I used less water and more color. As you can see here, I added the red at the end of this petal, but later I changed my mind and decided to go with red at the center and then purple at the end. But it was an easy fix. Even though I applied red to this petal, I could easily just build up to change it to look like more purple at the end. Since I'm using less water, it means that each layer is drying much quicker, so I can build up more and more contrast and depth to each petal. And I'm also applying a bit more darker shades like browns and blues into the reds, so I can get sort of a closer match to black, so I can get shadow underneath each petal and gives more depth and a 3D effect. When all the darker shades was applied, I decided to mix in a little bit of white into the colors that I had used, like the purples and the reds, so I can get more of a lighter tone on each petal, so I could start build up and prepare each petal for the highlights that I'm going to add as a final step. I felt like I wanted the petals to have a little bit more warmth to them, so I decided to add a bit of orange tone to the petals to make the petals look a bit more reddish than magenta. I'm going to use a thin brush, not bright white, but more white than before, and I'm starting to add all of these shiny details and highlights. It gives it more glossy effect on each petal. Now it's time for the center, and like I said, I decided to go with orange and yellows for this center. And I'm trying to go for sort of a glow effect on the center of the flower, so you can see that it has all of these kind of glowy details on the outside of these pollens in the center. I'm going to add more of these details later on in the drawing. It's a final step when the whole entire design is finished. When it comes to these tiny petals and leaves, I'm just going for the same sort of layered effect from dark to light, but not as detailed as the flower, because I want the flower to be the centerpiece of this design. So I'm not going for a highly detailed effect on these petals and leaves. So I felt that something was missing on the petals on the outside of the flower, and I decided to add some more lines off camera, and it makes such a huge difference if you look at the design from further away. If you see the left compared to the right side. So I just used my black ink pens and some black ink with a quill and just added some more lines to make the petals stand out more. I found this picture by the artist that I've credited in this video, and she had some petals with similar line art effect similar to my illustration, but hers were fuller. So I just played around with some line art to make these petals much fuller. You will also see that I'm playing around a bit with some white ink because I wanted to create sort of a cut-out effect, meaning white outlines on the outside of the design and other parts. And I also did some redefining using black ink, and then I'm going to finish off the entire design with some cool glowing particles. you guys, look at this. It worked! Just from seeing these flowers in this coloring book, and then just it reminded me of these designs by this illustrator. Then just playing around with different details, and I was so afraid that this paper was going to just crumble and fall apart and just get so destroyed. Obviously it's not 100% like the illustrations she has made, because she has made them digital. Yes, you can make it with traditional art also. Obviously I think if you're using more professional higher-end markers, for example, you can get those gradients and vibrant colors, and maybe as a final step you can use white ink or other similar mediums to get those bright highlights and specks like these dots or glowing particles that I added. It wasn't really that difficult. I just had to start with layers that are gradually getting brighter and brighter, and then add a very bright spot right in the middle, either bright white or a glowing yellow, something to make it look like it's really glowing. I went for more of a brush stroke effect instead of having just a gradient from one color to the other. These petals from the beginning had all of this line art. Felt that the easy way to camouflage them, or at least remove them, was to apply the colors in more of a brush stroke pattern, so it gives all of these lines of different variations of different tones, colors and shades. So that's why I went for that kind of effect on these petals, but it still has these gradients from red to purple. When I was finished with the coloring part of the flower, I noticed that the petals was like they didn't have that many details. It felt like they blended in too much with all of these geometric symbols. It was like you couldn't even notice them anymore. So that's why I felt like I have to add something, and I want them to be black and white with line art style. So I just played around with either a black ink pen or a quill to make the petals on the outside more bold and stand out, and make them also look much fuller. I'm really loving these white, there are like outlines. These white outlines makes it look like it's a sticker kind of effect. It looks like it could have been just something you can remove. A similar effect was on designs by this other artist. At first the plan was to add white outlines, but then I started to fill in these areas here, down here with black, and I thought that maybe it was going to be too difficult to add these white outlines. But then when I started using the white ink as the final step, the coverage of that white ink was so bright and opaque, so I noticed that I was actually able to get that white outline effect. So I started to play around with adding white outlines on these petals up here. And then I started with the flower, and I think I had to go over the same area like twice with white ink. That was enough for me to get this bright, stark white. I felt like that was the final step, adding these white details. One thing I will change if I have to erase some areas and want to use something white to erase it. I think the best option would be to not use at least this white ink that I use. Maybe it would be better if I use like white watercolor or white acrylic. Something that when it dries, it stays dry, or it doesn't move when you're going over with black ink. I noticed that even though the white ink had dried, when I went over the white ink with my black ink pens, I don't know what really happened. It was like some kind of reaction. The white ink started to make the tips of these ink pens started to dry out, even though they are brand new. It was like they didn't have any ink left, and I had no idea what was going on, because I needed to use the black ink pens to be able to do these straight lines with using a ruler and to apply all of these geometric symbols. So I was like, what's going on and what am I gonna do now? Because if these pens doesn't work, what do I actually have that is black that can help me create these sharp, straight lines in different sizes? But thankfully, if I just wipe the ink pens and maybe dip them in a little bit of water, and it was a process of back and forth when I was applying black details over the parts where I have painted white ink. So a bit of a struggle, but in the end I finally got down all of the black details that I needed. I could could also fill in all of these areas with the ink brush pen that I had, so that was no issue when I used that one over the white ink. And also the liquid black ink that I have in this little bottle that I can use the quill or just a brush, that was no problem to use over the white ink either. So I had to be a bit creative and go back and forth between those and the ink pens and see if I could solve this problem, and I was able to. If I'll do this again, then I think that the best option would be to at least not use this white ink as the background to erase details. If I know that I have to go over the white ink using my ink pens. But using other mediums seems to be working fine, going over the white liquid ink that I use. I was able to achieve the idea I had from the beginning and see if I could be able to create that as traditional art instead of digital art. And yes, it worked. There was many steps to get there. I regret nothing. It was a very fun process this. I feel very inspired to do something more like this. If I look at the... where do I have it? Here it is. I redecorated my office here, so I'm a bit confused about where I put all my things. After I created this one, I had more ideas, and I found, for example, this bird here that has some butterflies here, and I thought maybe I could create something cool here. Here is another one that has a lot of flowers that are more in a cluster, so I could easily get more flowers crammed into the same design, which was something I was hoping for when I was creating this one, but the flower up here was so far away from this one. Here's another one that has a lot of vines and flowers and some leaves. So that could be something. Maybe I will not work on it right now because I have a lot of projects planned that are not painting or drawing related, but it's going to be more towards the crafts direction. Something similar to the project that I made in February. Super happy with the finished result of this one, and if you want to see more like these, just let me know. But other than that, I'll see you in the next video.